made Higgins very rich, I can tell you that. Some other people who were invested in that plant as well. But all over the country, people are producing these prodigious amounts. If you just look at the raw numbers, something like, I forgot the exact number, 16 million rifles, thousands of machine guns of different calibers and types, thousands of artillery pieces, thousands of mortar tubes. It just goes on and on and on. There's a big plant over in northern Alabama I read about one time that produced poison gas. Huntsville, Alabama. I read about when they were decommissioning it back, I think about 20 years ago, which was a hell of a job because they had stored all this poison gas that had been manufactured there during World War II. It had never been used. In World War I, both sides used a lot of poison gas. It's a terrible weapon. It's very hard to control, not as effective as it's supposed to be, and so forth. But you know, in World War II, the military had enough money that it could do everything it wanted. So I decided it might as well go into the poison gas business too. And they manufactured all this stuff in Alabama and stored it there. And decades later, they had to get rid of it because it was an environmental hazard of grade A. Costly, time-consuming job. Just kidding. Well, that's our bulge here. That's the miracle of production. Now, one of the other things I've plotted in here is this dashed line that runs from the 1929 value up to the 1948 value. And that's a rate of growth line that the economy could have followed if it had grown at the same rate every year that it grew on average in getting from 1929 to 1948. Obviously, it didn't get there in that steady way, right? First it dropped, then it grew faster, then it grew way above that line. So, now that line is sometimes called the line of potential output of the economy. If you had fully employed resources in each of those intervening years, in the same way that you had in 1929 and 1948, when the economy was at a business cycle peak, you could have grown along that straight line. That's your maximum amount you could achieve each year. Now, the question that ought to arise sometime to you if you ponder this sort of thing is, how can you ever get above your maximum potential to produce? Way above it. How can you produce in excess of what you're capable of producing? That doesn't make any sense. It's logically self-contradictory. Well, there are some answers that could be given to explain that in part. One way you could do it is by, during those years of the production bulge, you could basically be eating up your capital stock. And to a substantial degree, that's what was done during World War II. Because all these resources were being channeled to military uses, resources were taken away from people who wanted to use them to maintain their existing plants and equipment and other forms of capital they used to produce their outputs. So if you look at industries like, say, the bus industry, all these buses running around carrying people in cities, they weren't given new buses during the war. They had to run the old buses into the ground and repair them best they could. They weren't even able to get spare parts when they needed them. Same thing with the trains. The trains weren't able to get all these new cars they needed as they wore out. They weren't able to replace their equipment when they needed to because the government wasn't making available to them enough resources to maintain their existing stocks of capital. And this happened probably most noticeably in housing stock, because the government had put on all kinds of price controls during the war, including controls on rents. And when the rents were controlled, landlords found it didn't pay them anymore to maintain the apartments. So the apartments just, when they needed fixing, they didn't get fixed. You You might scrounge around and find some way to keep them going, keep that plumbing from leaking all over the place or whatever. But the capital stock was being run down. That's one of the answers to the bulge, the miracle of production. But the main answer has nothing to do with that. If you go back and look at the GDP during the war, about 40% of it is measured as being output sold to the government for war purposes. That matches up with the proportion of the labor force that I showed you that's involved in war making or war supply. Now, that output sold to the government for war purposes was not priced on a free market the way ordinarily you would price bread or shoes or even a new piece of equipment for a factory. When the War Department wanted something, let's say it wanted a bunch of B-29 bombers. It did in fact want a bunch of them. There was only one company that made them, the Boeing company. So the War Department said its man, probably some major, often worked real high-ranking officers that did this kind of work. So the major came out from the Pentagon, and he went to the Boeing company in Seattle, and he says, you know, we want 100 of these batch of B-29s, and here's what we'd like to pay you for them. And the Boeing guy said, no, that's so stingy. I don't even know that we can do it for that. And they dickered. But look, they finally settled on a price. The price they settled on, Boeing made plenty of money. It bore no risk, because if Boeing screwed up, even by its own incompetence, the government would bail it out. They didn't care. It wasn't the Pentagon's money, and they wanted the airplanes. They didn't care what they paid for them. And that was across the board. It wasn't just B-29s. It was practically everything the War Department, the Navy Department, the Shipping Commission bought during the war. Those were the big government buyers. The Shipping Commission was the government agency acquiring this enormous number of merchant ships. Because this is an overseas war. You've got to take the troops and all their supplies and everything across the ocean to get it to the fronts. So you need thousands and thousands of cargo ships. My dad helped make those during the war in Portland, Oregon. Kaiser plant. Kaiser made a ton of money making ships. Liberty ships, they were called. We always get stuff a great name when we go to war. We had a B-24 bomber was called a Liberator. The people the bombs are dropped on didn't feel very liberated by it, I'm pretty sure. And even though, you know, truth be told, the people we claim to have liberated, like the French, were often having our bombs dropped on them too. I've been to the French cities where you can see photographs of what the place looked like in the middle of 1944. That is just piles of rubble. Beautiful cities. Just reduced by bombing, shelling, liberating those Frenchmen. Anyhow, we produced all this stuff. Its prices were arbitrary. Its prices had no relationship to consumer valuations, no relationship to opportunity costs being borne by the buyers or the suppliers. It's just totally non-market pricing. And if there's one thing that you should know from Ludwig von Mises, I'm sure Walter's told you about this time and again. Bill probably has too. Non-market pricing is intrinsically arbitrary. It cannot be anything else. There's no way to make it mean anything. So during the war, we had a classic case of massive amounts of output, in some sense, you know, thousands of airplanes, thousands of ships, blah, blah, blah. Massive amounts of output being priced arbitrarily, and then the whole valuation thrown into the GDP, where it comprises more than 4/10 of the total, but means nothing. Nothing, 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 zero. It means nothing. Okay? Now, I've had lots of arguments over the years with colleagues of mine in economic history who say, oh no, it doesn't mean nothing, you it's still connected somehow with civilian markets, or it's connected with this, that, or the other. You know, it's close enough. You know, it's close enough. I had a quarrel like this one time with a Nobel Prize winner at a conference who got really angry with me when I argued with him that the valuations he had put on the goods given to slaves in the Old South could be valued sort of precisely, even though the slaves had no control over what they consumed or how much. It was totally dictated by the masters. Well, we've got a similar situation during the war. These prices are just dictated by the government. If the Boeing guy just dug in his heels and said, that's not enough, the guy from the War Department would say, hang on there, Charlie. If you're going to make this hard on us, we'll just take over your damn plant and pay you whatever we want. It's all illegal now, and we'll do it. Look around you. Look at the other places we've done it. So most of the time people went along, got along, and made some money. They didn't hold out for the money, but they were well compensated at prices that mean nothing. So the whole GDP during the war means nothing. Sometimes when I do this analysis, I just leave those data out. It's just a big gap there. Now I put them in here because what this makes it look like is, you know, the big miracle of production and stuff, which is hogwash. But at the same time, it allows me to contrast what's shown in these bars down here. These bars are the non-government part of the GDP. And of course, that's messed up during the war too by price controls and the enormous impact of the war production. But it's more meaningful than the strictly military output, at least relatively. And what you see during the war is not the carnival of consumption that historians talk about, not the having guns and butter. You see, in 1941, the private part of the GDP is up here. It hasn't gotten back to its trend line yet. So there's still some unemployed resources, as I said. But it doesn't get any closer now during the war. It falls in 1942 and 43, recovers only a little bit in 44, and even in 1945, it's only back about where it was in the pre-war year, 1941. So there's no wartime prosperity. That's hogwash. There's no wartime prosperity. But this makes it look better than it was. Because it wasn't just that the private valuation of output fell. It was also that much of the choice that consumers would normally have was taken away from them. Not just choice about price setting, but literally the price about what they could buy and not buy, how they could buy it. I already mentioned the automobiles. You couldn't buy a new automobile during the war. They weren't made anymore. It wasn't really until 1947 that the car companies got back to producing very many civilian automobiles. They made a few in 46. And if you're an old car buff, you'll have trouble finding a 46 Ford. They exist, but not many. Because all those Ford factories that were making Liberator bombers, had to be put back and equipped, and people trained to make automobiles after the war. So, more guns, less butter. Okay? There's definitely a gigantic opportunity cost associated with the economy during World War II. It's not the crude maniac miracle of massive government budgets suddenly lifting all boats. It's nothing like that. You enslave 10 million people in the armed forces. And I don't use that word lightly. What do you call it? You tell somebody, get over here and do what I tell you in the army or go to prison. Is that slavery? Yeah, that's slavery. So you enslaved all those people, and then you got another couple million to join because they didn't want to be drafted and enslaved, because if they were, they had a better chance of being assigned to the infantry. or they would be sent off to some hellhole and blown to bits by artillery. Okay? That was not a really great deal. So guys clamored to join the Navy, which wasn't always great, you know. You get blown up there too. But at least you were clean when you got blown up. Covered with lice and mud. That's the infantry. They clamored to join the Navy. They clamored to join the Army Air Corps, as it was called at the beginning of the war. And again, that wasn't necessarily a great deal. If you were in a bomber crew over Europe, in fact, that's a terrible deal. You have a very high chance of getting killed before you finish your tour. If you've never read the book Catch-22, I'm going to give you an assignment. Read Catch-22. That's one of the most important books you'll ever read. And it's about missing Italy. You'll see he's a crewman on a bomber in Italy. And basically what he wants to do is live. But he's in the wrong spot for that. That's one of many troubles.